In the early hours of 15 August 1944, as bells rang out across the village of Saint-Martin to herald the Allied liberation, Céline Beaumont stood frozen behind her curtains, watching uniformed men mark her door with a thick stroke of black paint. At 32 years of age, the former schoolteacher had survived 4 years of German occupation, only to face a different kind of terror from her own countrymen. The crowd gathering in the dawn light carried scissors that caught the first rays of sun, while someone shouted her name with the same venom once reserved for collaborators and traitors. On the edges of the assembly, Henri Mercier raised his camera, hands steady despite the gravity of what he was about to document, one of the most brutal public rituals of vengeance that France would inflict upon its own daughters. The sharp smell of tar mixed with the murmurs of neighbors who had once greeted Céline warmly, now transformed into a tribunal without judge or jury. This is the story of how liberation became punishment, and how justice became spectacle across a traumatized nation. Subscribe now to discover what the official histories erased about the Tendues, the shorn women of France. The village of Saint-Martin rested in the Loire Valley, approximately 200 kilometers south of Paris, a place where generations had tended vineyards and preserved traditions that gave rhythm to rural French life. Before the war, the villagers marked time by harvests and festivals, by births and marriages announced from the bell tower of Sainte-Agnès Church. By 1944, they measured time differently. 4 years of occupation, 1,460 days of German boots on their cobblestone streets, of ration cards and curfews, of whispers behind closed shutters, and of choices that would eventually divide neighbor from neighbor. Céline Beaumont had arrived in the village in 1938, a young woman from Lyon with modern ideas and a teaching certificate. The village school consisted of one room where children of various ages learned reading, mathematics, and the glory of the French Republic. She brought books the village had never seen and organized theatrical performances that made parents smile with pride. With her dark hair always neatly arranged and her clothes modest but never provincial, she represented something the village both admired and regarded with mild suspicion: education, sophistication, the world beyond their fields and homes. When German forces swept across France in 1940, Saint-Martin, like thousands of other villages, adapted to survive. The mayor, Auguste Pelletier, a veteran of the Great War with a permanent limp and a chest of medals he no longer displayed, maintained official communications with the occupation authorities. The local gendarme, Marcel Rousseau, continued to handle minor disputes while avoiding confrontation with German military police. The butcher, the baker, the postmaster all continued their functions, navigating the narrow channel between necessary accommodation and outright collaboration. Céline continued teaching, though the curriculum changed. Maps showing French colonial territories were removed. History lessons ended with the Franco-Prussian War. German language instruction became mandatory for older students. She moved through these changes like most of her neighbors, with outward compliance and inward resistance. She taught the required German phrases during school hours, but whispered to her students about French poets after class. She hung the approved portrait of Marshal Pétain beside the blackboard, but kept a small tricolor ribbon hidden in her desk drawer. Life under occupation presented impossible choices, disguised as simple ones. When German officers requisitioned rooms in the village for visiting officials, some families reluctantly cleared space in their homes. Others claimed illness, vermin, structural damage, any excuse to keep enemy soldiers from sleeping under their roofs. Céline, living alone in a small but well-maintained house near the school, received such an order in March of 1941. The officer billeted with her was Hauptmann Werner Keller, a 40-year-old administrator from Frankfurt who spoke fluent French and collected regional maps. He was neither cruel nor particularly kind, simply a man following orders and attempting, like Céline, to navigate an impossible situation with minimum damage. He slept in her spare room, ate breakfast at her table, and maintained formal politeness. He left each morning at 7:30 precisely and returned after evening curfew. He never entered her bedroom or the schoolroom. He offered extra rations occasionally, which she initially refused, but eventually accepted when hunger became too persistent to ignore. Their arrangement continued for 17 months. The village observed with the heightened attention that small communities direct toward any deviation from pattern. They noted when lights burned late in her windows. They counted the bottles left for collection. They watched for changes in her posture, her clothing, her expressions. Some neighbors stopped greeting her in the market. Others whispered that she had little choice in the matter, that survival sometimes required unpleasant compromise. What transformed tolerance into condemnation occurred in the summer of 1942, when Lucien Moreau, age 19, was arrested for distributing resistance pamphlets. German authorities conducted house searches throughout Saint-Martin, finding nothing until they reached the Moreau farm on the village outskirts. There, hidden beneath floorboards, they discovered a radio transmitter and coded messages. Jean-Baptiste Moreau, Lucien's father, claimed sole responsibility. Both father and daughter were taken to regional headquarters for questioning. Lucien returned 3 days later, released without explanation. Jean-Baptiste never returned. Rumors spread that someone had provided information about the Moreau family to German authorities. 2 weeks after Lucien's release, Hauptmann Keller was transferred to another district. Before departing, he left a package for Céline, coffee beans, real chocolate, silk stockings, items unavailable to ordinary French citizens. The delivery occurred in daylight, observed by the butcher's wife and 2 elderly men playing cards outside the cafe. That evening, the word whore appeared on Céline's door in white paint. She removed it before her students arrived the next morning, scrubbing until her hands were raw. No one mentioned it. Teaching continued. The occupation continued. But something fundamental had changed in how the village perceived her. Invitations ceased. Conversations ended when she approached. Parents began keeping their children home from school with vague excuses about farm work and household duties. By winter, her classroom had emptied to half its previous attendance. Céline wrote letters to the Education Authority requesting transfer to another village. No response came. Administrative functions throughout occupied France operated slowly when they operated at all. She considered returning to Lyon, but knew her teaching position provided the only security available in increasingly uncertain times. She remained in Saint-Martin, isolated but present, marking assignments, ringing the school bell, and walking home alone through streets where she once had been greeted warmly. When the tide of war shifted in 1943, with Allied victories in North Africa and Russian advances on the Eastern Front, resistance activities intensified throughout France. In Saint-Martin, this manifested in minor sabotage, telephone lines cut, vehicle tires slashed, occasional graffiti appearing overnight. German reprisals followed predictable patterns. Curfews tightened, rations reduced, public gatherings prohibited. Life constricted further into a tense holding pattern. Céline observed these changes with the same careful neutrality she had maintained throughout the occupation. She neither participated in resistance activities nor reported suspicious behavior to authorities. She taught her remaining students, tended her small garden, and waited like everyone else for a war that had to end eventually. Yet her isolation deepened. Even those who had defended her initially now avoided association. In the binary logic of occupation, neutrality increasingly appeared indistinguishable from collaboration. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, news reached Saint-Martin via whispered conversations and hidden radio broadcasts. German forces in the village grew visibly tense, increasing patrols and requisitioning additional supplies. Families began hiding valuables, anticipating either retreating Germans seeking portable wealth or arriving liberators demanding evidence of patriotism. The village existed in suspended animation, waiting for the moment when one authority would replace another. That moment arrived on August 15th. German forces withdrew overnight, leaving with minimal ceremony. Their departure created a vacuum immediately filled by members of local resistance groups who emerged from hiding, armbands declaring their affiliation, weapons displayed prominently. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers, tradesmen, and youths too young for the regular army. Neighbors, transformed by occupation into warriors, now faced with establishing authority in the chaotic interregnum before official Allied forces arrived. Henri Mercier had documented the occupation of Saint-Martin with his camera, though never openly. A professional photographer before the war, he had maintained his studio in the village square, taking identity photos and portraits while secretly capturing evidence of German presence. His camera recorded requisition notices posted on the mairie, officers inspecting marketplace goods, children watching military vehicles with curious eyes. He developed these images in his darkroom at night, storing negatives beneath loose floorboards, creating an unauthorized visual history of Saint-Martin under occupation. On Liberation morning, Henri brought his camera into the open, photographing German vehicles disappearing down the eastern road, resistance fighters establishing checkpoints, villagers emerging with long hidden tricolor flags. He captured the spontaneous celebration in the square, the breaking open of wine cellars, sealed from German requisition, the embraces between neighbors who had survived together. These were the images he had imagined creating for years, the visual documentation of freedom restored. He did not anticipate photographing what came next. The crowd formed quickly outside the cafe. Initially, just a dozen people listening to Philippe Bonnet, the blacksmith's son who had disappeared 2 years earlier to join a resistance group in the forests. Now Philippe stood on a chair, gesturing emphatically, his voice carrying across the square. Henri moved closer, camera ready, expecting patriotic declarations. "We all know who collaborated while we fought and died," Philippe shouted. "Before the real authorities arrive, we must clean our village of those who betrayed France." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the growing crowd. Names were called out. The mayor who had implemented German directives, a businessman who had secured German contracts, families who had hosted officers in their homes. Each name received louder approval, the crowd's energy building toward action. Then someone shouted, "The schoolteacher! The German's whore!" Henri lowered his camera slightly. watching the crowd's mood shift from celebratory to punitive. This was not the liberation imagery he had anticipated preserving, yet he recognized the historical significance unfolding before him. He raised his camera again as the crowd began moving toward Céline's house near the school, their pace deliberate, their purpose crystallizing with each step. They found Céline standing in her doorway, alerted by the approaching noise. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back, her expression revealing neither defiance nor fear, only resignation, as though she had long expected this moment. Philippe stepped forward, assuming the authority no official had granted him. Céline Beaumont, you are accused of horizontal collaboration with the enemy. This village charges you with intimate betrayal of France. What do you say? Céline's voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. I say that none of you lived in my house or my skin during these 4 years. I made compromises to survive, as did everyone. You did more than compromise, called a woman's voice from the crowd. Madame Fournier, the butcher's wife. You took their gifts. You shared their bed. I took food when I was hungry, Céline responded. I provided a room when commanded. I neither betrayed nor denounced any French citizen. Her eyes found Lucienne Moreau in the crowd. I never provided information to Germans about anyone. Lucienne looked away, her face unreadable. Philippe raised his hand for silence. The time for excuses has ended. Justice will be administered as it has been throughout liberated France. Bring the scissors and the chair. What followed adhered to a ritual enacted in hundreds of villages and towns across France as communities enacted retribution against women accused of collaboration horizontale. 2 men seized Céline by the arms while others brought a wooden chair into the street. They forced her to sit as Philippe produced large shears. The crowd pressed closer, their expressions ranging from solemn satisfaction to uncomfortable fascination. Henri positioned himself to document the proceedings, his camera capturing frame after frame of a scene repeated throughout France, yet absent from official liberation narratives. In the name of France, Philippe declared, and do we remove the hair you beautified for German eyes? The first cut was theatrical, Philippe holding aloft a thick lock of Céline's dark hair while the crowd cheered. Then others stepped forward, women primarily, neighbors who had once exchanged recipes and pleasantries with Céline, taking turns with the scissors, reducing her carefully maintained hair to uneven patches. Some cuts came too close to the scalp, drawing blood that trickled down her neck. Céline remained silent throughout, her gaze fixed forward, neither resisting nor acknowledging her public humiliation. Henri photographed it all, the scissors catching morning light, the growing pile of hair around the chair legs, the transformation of Céline's appearance from dignified to grotesque. He captured the crowd's expressions, the children hoisted onto shoulders for better viewing, the old men nodding in approval, the few villagers watching from a distance with evident discomfort. His camera preserved what written records would minimize or omit entirely, the systematic degradation of women as communities processed trauma through gendered punishment. The haircutting represented only the beginning. Once Céline's scalp had been reduced to uneven stubble, Philippe produced a pot of tar and a brush. Mark her so everyone will know what she is, he commanded. Women from the crowd stepped forward, dipping the brush and painting a swastika on Céline's forehead. Others added the word collaboratrice across her cheeks. The tar stuck to her skin and remaining hair, its industrial smell mixing with the morning air. They pulled her from the chair and began the procession, the final component of the ritual. Pushed forward by the crowd, Céline was forced to walk through village streets, past the school where she had taught, past the church where no one had intervened on her behalf, past the mairie where official authority remained conspicuously absent. Children ran alongside, turning punishment into spectacle. Some villagers threw rotting vegetables or spat as she passed. Others closed their shutters, unwilling to participate, yet equally unwilling to object. Henri followed, documenting each stage, his camera creating a record more honest than any official account would provide. He captured the tears that finally broke through Céline's composed facade when they passed the school. He photographed the moment an elderly woman, Madame Cloutier, who had lost 2 sons in the previous war, stepped from the crowd to walk beside Céline, not touching her, but providing silent witness that complicated the narrative of unanimous community judgment. The procession ended at the village square where celebrations continued in strange juxtaposition to the punishment ritual. Céline was forced onto a platform normally used for market day announcements, displayed like a cautionary example. Philippe stood beside her, addressing the gathered villagers. This is how France cleanses itself. This is the price of betrayal. Remember her shame and remember that patriots are watching. The crowd began to disperse, their appetite for spectacle temporarily satisfied, turning attention to wine and food and the more pleasant aspects of liberation. Céline remained on the platform, swaying slightly, her face expressionless beneath the tar. Henri approached cautiously, uncertain of his own motivations. Was he still documenting, or had he crossed into intervention? You should go home now, he said quietly, not looking through his viewfinder. They've had their performance. Celine's voice came hoarse from hours of silent endurance. They've marked my door. Home is no longer safe. Henri looked toward her house and saw she was right. The black paint marking her door was visible even from the square. He hesitated, weighing responsibility against self-preservation. To help her meant associating himself with her punishment, potentially inviting similar treatment. Yet, to document her humiliation without offering assistance made him complicit in a different way. My sister lives 3 kilometers outside the village, he said finally. You can go there until this madness passes. I'll take you after dark. Celine looked at him fully for the first time. Why would you help me? You've been photographing my degradation all morning. I photograph truth, Henri replied, not just the parts people want to remember. He glanced at his camera. This isn't justice. This is something else entirely. As darkness fell over Saint-Martin, Henri led Céline through back gardens and field paths to his sister's small farmhouse. Marguerite Mercier opened her door without question, helping clean tar from Céline's face and tending to cuts on her scalp. The 2 women spoke little, sharing instead the silent understanding of those who had navigated occupation with impossible choices. Henri left them with promises to return the following day, carrying his camera and the images that would eventually challenge sanitized narratives of liberation. The pattern established in Saint-Martin repeated throughout France, as communities liberated themselves in the vacuum between German retreat and Allied arrival. Between 20,000 and 40,000 women experienced similar ritual humiliation, their punishment documented in photographs that proliferated as peculiar souvenirs of liberation. The specific accusations varied. Intimate relationships with German soldiers, professional associations, acceptance of gifts or assistance, but the gendered nature of punishment remained consistent. While male collaborators faced legal proceedings, imprisonment or execution following formal charges, women's bodies became sites of community catharsis, their punishment immediate, public, and largely extrajudicial. Official France would later minimize these events, relegating them to footnotes in liberation narratives, or dismissing them as spontaneous excesses quickly contained by restored authority. Yet photographs like Henri's preserved evidence of organized ritual, of community participation, of punishment selectively applied to women whose perceived crimes often amounted to nothing more than survival strategies in impossible circumstances. For Céline Beaumont, the immediate aftermath of liberation meant 3 weeks hiding at Marguerite Mercier's farm, venturing outside only after dark, waiting for official administrative structures to replace improvised justice. Henri visited regularly, bringing news and supplies, developing the photographs that documented her humiliation, while questioning his own role in preserving images that simultaneously exposed injustice and perpetuated degradation. "What will you do with those pictures?" Céline asked one evening as they sat in Marguerite's kitchen, the scarf covering her damaged hair a constant reminder of her status. "Right now, nothing," Henri replied. "The village isn't ready to see itself truthfully, but someday, when this war truly ends in people's minds, these images will matter. They'll show what we became when fear replaced law." Céline touched her growing stubble beneath the scarf. "No one will care about women like me. History remembers heroes and villains, not those of us caught between impossible choices." "Then we must create a different kind of history," Henri said, "one that remembers complexity." By September 1944, official French administrative authority returned to Saint-Martin with the arrival of government representatives from the provisional government. They established formal processes for investigating collaboration, replacing impromptu public punishment with bureaucratic procedure. The Committee of Liberation reviewed accusations, collected statements, and issued judgments ranging from civic degradation to property confiscation. Céline's case came before the committee in late September. The formal accusation, intelligence with the enemy, carried potential imprisonment if substantiated. Henri attended the hearing, held in the mairie office where German notices had once been posted. The committee members, 5 men and 1 woman, all with verified resistance credentials, reviewed statements from villagers regarding Céline's relationship with Hauptmann Keller. Madame Fournier testified about German gifts delivered openly. The postmaster described letters with German military postmarks arriving regularly for 2 years. 3 parents explained their decisions to remove children from Céline's classroom as protection against her influence. Each testimony constructed a narrative of collaboration, defining her actions during occupation as voluntary betrayal rather than coerced survival. When Céline finally spoke, her voice remained steady despite the weight of community judgment already executed against her. She described the requisitioning order that brought Keller to her home, the formal distance he maintained throughout their cohabitation, the careful navigation required to preserve her position and safety. She acknowledged accepting food when offered, as did anyone with hunger stronger than pride, but denied any romantic involvement or information sharing. "I neither loved nor betrayed," she concluded. I survived, as did everyone in this room, by making compromises that kept me alive and functioning. The difference is that my compromises were visible because I am a woman living alone, without the protection of family narrative or community standing. The committee deliberated for 3 days before delivering their verdict. Insufficient evidence for criminal collaboration, but enough concern to justify dismissal from her teaching position and recommendation for relocation. Céline received the judgment without visible reaction, having already experienced the community's more visceral verdict on Liberation Morning. What the committee could not restore, her hair, her dignity, her place in the community, outweighed their official determination. The formal processes of justice arrived too late for women like Céline, their punishment already executed through ritual humiliation that left permanent marks more lasting than prison sentences. The distinction between survival and collaboration, so carefully evaluated in male cases, received little consideration when applied to women whose perceived crimes involved their bodies. Henri continued documenting the aftermath, photographing the committee hearings, the return of displaced villagers, the reconstruction efforts that physically repaired Saint-Martin while leaving emotional damage unaddressed. His images captured the village's transition from occupation to liberation to the uneasy normality that followed, a visual record preserving complexities. Official narratives would simplify. For Céline, the committee's verdict offered neither vindication nor closure. She remained at Marguerite's farm through autumn, her hair growing back unevenly, her future uncertain in a community that had literally marked her as unwelcome. Teaching positions elsewhere proved impossible, without references or explanation for her departure from Saint-Martin. Her practical options narrowed to leaving France entirely, or rebuilding anonymity in a distant city where liberation rituals remained unknown. Paris, she told Henri during his final visit before her departure. Thousands of women experienced what I did. Some returned to their communities afterward, wearing scarves in silence. Others disappeared into cities where anonymity provides protection against memory. Henri nodded, understanding her choice while recognizing its injustice. Will you stay in touch? Let me know you're safe. Céline considered this, weighing the value of connection against the appeal of complete reinvention. Perhaps someday, when this becomes history rather than wound, when France acknowledges all its complicated truths about occupation and liberation. That may be a very long time, Henri said quietly. Yes, Céline agreed. I suspect it will be. She left Saint-Martin in November 1944, carrying a single suitcase and the identity papers that labeled her a schoolteacher, without mentioning her status as une tendue, a shorn woman. The train carried her toward Paris, where thousands navigated similar aftermaths, their punishment neither documented in official records nor acknowledged in triumphant liberation narratives. Henri remained in Saint-Martin, reopening his photography studio, developing portraits of families reunited after evacuation or military service. Villagers rarely mentioned Liberation Morning, or Céline Beaumont, though her house remained empty, the black paint on her door weathering slowly but never completely disappearing. The village absorbed her absence as it had absorbed other wartime losses, without commemoration or acknowledgement. The photographs Henri had taken, of Céline's shearing, of the procession, of other punishment rituals enacted in neighboring communities, remained undeveloped for years, stored in metal containers beneath his studio floorboards. He could neither display them during the immediate post-war period, when France collectively constructed heroic resistance narratives, nor destroy them, recognizing their historical significance. They existed in suspended documentation, like so many uncomfortable truths about occupation and liberation. In 1954, a decade after liberation, Henri finally developed these images, creating a collection he titled Les non-dits de la libération, the unspoken aspects of liberation. He approached galleries in Paris, where sufficient time had passed to permit more nuanced examination of the liberation period. Most declined, citing ongoing sensitivities. One small gallery near Montparnasse agreed to a limited exhibition, displayed for 3 weeks to minimal attendance and newspaper coverage. Among the visitors was a woman in her early 40s, hair now fully regrown and styled fashionably, wearing the professional attire of a ministry administrator. She moved methodically through the exhibition, studying each photograph with careful attention, pausing longest before images from Saint-Martin. When Henri approached, she turned with the composed expression she had maintained throughout her public humiliation a decade earlier. Céline, he said quietly, surprised, despite having half expected her appearance since the exhibition opened. The photographs are powerful, she said, gesturing toward the images of her own punishment. You've preserved what France wants to forget. They moved to a cafe across from the gallery, ordering coffee and speaking quietly about the decade between Liberation Morning and their reunion. Céline described her reconstruction in Paris, administrative work at the Education Ministry, where her teaching background proved valuable, an apartment in the 15th arrondissement, friendships with people who knew nothing of her history. She had created the life promised by the resistance slogan Vivre libre, live free, though not in the manner liberation narratives imagined. Henri shared the evolution of Saint-Martin after her departure. Philippe Bonnet had parlayed his resistance credentials into political ambitions, running unsuccessfully for mayor before accepting a position with the Veterans Administration. Lucienne Moreau had married a farmer from a neighboring village, producing 3 children and rarely mentioning her father's disappearance. The community had rebuilt physically and emotionally, constructing shared narratives about occupation that emphasized resistance while minimizing accommodation. "Have any other tondus returned?" Céline asked, using the term for shorn women that had entered French vernacular despite official reluctance to acknowledge the phenomenon. "A few, in other villages," Henri replied, "always quietly, usually after family negotiation. They wear scarves for years afterward, not because their hair hasn't grown back, but because the community needs visual reminder of their status. The punishment continues, long after the shearing ends." Céline nodded, understanding the permanent marking that extended beyond physical appearance. "We carry different wounds from the men. They experienced occupation and resistance as a binary, collaborate or fight. We navigated more complicated terrain where survival itself became collaboration." They maintained occasional contact after that meeting, exchanging letters several times annually, sharing observations about France's evolving relationship with its wartime history. Henri's photographs gradually gained recognition among historians, documenting gendered experiences of war, though mainstream narratives continued minimizing the arbitrary excesses of liberation. Céline never returned to Saint-Martin, building instead a life defined by her choices rather than community judgment. In 1970, as a new generation began questioning sanitized wartime narratives, a historian from the Sorbonne contacted Henri about his liberation photographs. The resulting book, Gender and Justice, Women's Bodies as Sites of Post-War Retribution, included Céline's story alongside those of other tondus across France, documenting the systematic nature of what had previously been dismissed as isolated incidents. For the first time, academic attention focused on the gendered application of justice during liberation, how women's survival strategies became collaboration while men's similar actions received contextual understanding. Céline, by then approaching 60 and retired from administrative work, agreed to be interviewed for the project, breaking decades of silence about her experience. Her testimony provided crucial perspective on the choices available to women during occupation and the community dynamics that transformed neighbors into accusers during liberation. "The greatest myth about occupation," she told the historian, "was that clear moral choices existed for ordinary people. Resistance narratives celebrate those who fought, but most of us simply lived day by day, making compromises that preserved some fragment of normality. Women's compromises involved our bodies, where we lived, what we ate, who we associated with, making our survival visible in ways men's was not." The book received limited attention when published, but entered university curricula, gradually influencing how subsequent generations understood liberation's complexity. Henri's photographs became historical documents, preserved in archives alongside resistance pamphlets and occupation notices, providing visual evidence of what written records often omitted. The images of Céline, initially taken as documentation of justice, transformed over decades into evidence of injustice, their interpretation shifting as France's relationship with its wartime history evolved. When Henri died in 1982, his collection of liberation photographs passed to the French National Archives, catalogued as significant historical documentation of post-war transitional justice. Céline attended his funeral in Paris rather than Saint-Martin, honoring the man who had both documented her humiliation and preserved evidence of its problematic nature. Their complicated relationship, neither simply photographer and subject nor fully friends, reflected the moral ambiguities both had navigated during and after occupation. Céline lived until 1997, long enough to see academic recognition of the tondus phenomenon and the inclusion of women's complex occupation experiences in more nuanced historical narratives. She never married or had children, building instead connections through her work and carefully selected friendships. In her final years, she occasionally spoke to student groups about occupation and liberation, offering perspective on historical periods increasingly viewed through simplified media representations. "Remember complexity," she told a group of university students shortly before her death. "Resist the temptation to divide the past into heroes and villains. Most of history happens in the vast middle, where ordinary people make difficult choices with limited information and constrained options. Judge less, understand more." She was buried in Paris rather than Saint-Martin, her funeral attended by colleagues, friends, and several historians who had interviewed her over decades. Her death certificate listed her occupation as educator, acknowledging the teaching career abbreviated by war and community judgment. No mention appeared of her status as une tondue, though that experience had shaped her subsequent life as profoundly as any professional identity. In 2004, 60 years after liberation, the mayor of Saint-Martin, a woman elected on a platform of economic development and historical preservation, organized a commemoration of the village's wartime experience. The event included an exhibition of Henri's photographs displayed in the mairie, where the Liberation Committee had once determined Céline's fate. Among the attendees were elderly villagers who had witnessed liberation mourning, and younger generations for whom occupation existed only as family stories and historical documents. The exhibition deliberately included the punishment rituals alongside resistance activities and daily life under occupation, presenting the village's history in its full complexity. Céline's image appeared with her name and subsequent history, acknowledging what had previously been omitted from community narratives. The black paint on her door, visible in several photographs, had long since been removed when her house was eventually sold and renovated in the 1960s, erasing the physical marker of her status, while Henri's images preserved its documentation. After touring the exhibition, villagers gathered in the square where Céline had been displayed on Liberation Morning. The mayor unveiled a small plaque acknowledging all victims of occupation and its aftermath, resistance fighters executed, deportees who never returned, and women punished during liberation without formal process. The plaque named no individuals, but recognized collective trauma and injustice previously unacknowledged in official commemorations. Communities heal by acknowledging all their wounds, the mayor stated, not only those that align with preferred narratives. Our village's history includes resistance and accommodation, heroism and fear, justice and injustice. We honor that full complexity today. Among those present was an elderly Lucien Moreau, the resistance courier whose father's arrest had indirectly contributed to suspicion falling on Céline. After the ceremony, she approached the exhibition organizer, requesting contact information for Céline's surviving relatives or connections. "There's something I've needed to say for 60 years, she explained. When informed of Céline's death years earlier, Lucien nodded as though expecting this information. "Then perhaps I'll write it down instead. Some truths matter even when those who needed to hear them are gone." Her subsequent letter, addressed to those who remember Céline Beaumont and provided to the Village Historical Association, revealed what had remained unspoken during the Liberation Committee hearing, that Hauptmann Keller had intervened to secure her release after her arrest in 1942, requesting leniency based on her youth. This intervention, unknown to Céline or the village, had likely saved Lucien from deportation to a concentration camp, where many resistance members disappeared without trace. "I remained silent during her accusation," Lucien wrote, "because acknowledging a German officer's mercy complicated the narrative we needed during liberation, that resistance was uncompromised, and occupation authorities universally malevolent. I could not defend her without undermining my father's martyrdom and resistance narratives. That silence has weighted my conscience for 60 years. The letter entered the village archives alongside Henri's photographs and committee records, adding another layer to the continuously evolving understanding of occupation's complexity. The story of Céline Beaumont, schoolteacher, alleged collaborator, tendue, a survivor, became not simply one woman's experience, but emblematic of how communities process trauma through gendered punishment and how historical narratives simplify lived complexity into manageable binaries. What happened in Saint-Martin occurred in hundreds of communities across liberated France. Women's bodies became sites where populations processed trauma, projected guilt, and enacted retribution for perceived betrayal. Between survival and collaboration existed countless gradations of accommodation that occupation required, yet punishments recognized no such nuance. The shearing rituals, tar markings, and public processions provided visible catharsis at the expense of women who had navigated occupation with the limited options available to them. The tendus phenomenon reveals how justice applied differently to men and women during liberation, how male collaboration received formal investigation, while female association with occupiers warranted immediate bodily punishment. It exposes the gendered nature of patriotism and betrayal, where women's bodies symbolically represented national honor, requiring purification through ritual humiliation. Céline Beaumont's experience, from respected teacher to marked woman to eventual historical witness, traces France's evolving relationship with its occupation history. Initially suppressed in triumphant liberation narratives, the tendus gradually entered historical recognition as France developed capacity to acknowledge wartime complexities. Henri's photographs, initially documenting punishment rituals, transformed over decades into evidence challenging simplified resistance narratives and exposing gendered justice. The shearing rituals of liberation represented not justice, but communities processing collective trauma through selective punishment. Women like Céline carried that punishment physically and psychologically long after hair regrew. Their experiences minimized in historical accounts that preferred celebrating resistance over examining moral complexities. Their stories remind us that history happens primarily in the ambiguous middle ground, where ordinary people make difficult choices with limited options, not in the clear moral certainties retrospection imposes. For the women whose hair fell on streets across France in 1944, liberation brought not freedom but a different kind of occupation, their bodies controlled and marked by communities replacing one authority with another. Their punishment reminds us that justice requires process rather than spectacle, evidence rather than assumption, and recognition that survival itself constitutes resistance when options narrow to impossible choices. Céline Beaumont's hair grew back. The tar washed away. She rebuilt a life beyond Saint-Martin. Yet the marking of her body and identity during Liberation Morning remained present in every subsequent choice and relationship. The true measure of occupation's damage extends beyond physical destruction or political collaboration. It lives in how communities fracture under pressure and how moral complexity reduces to simplified judgment when fear replaces understanding. The tondeuses of France, 20,000 to 40,000 women punished through ritual humiliation, represent history's unresolved complexity, the uncomfortable truth that liberation contained darkness alongside light. Their experiences, preserved in photographs like Henri's, challenge us to resist binary narratives and recognize that understanding requires acknowledging all aspects of the past, not only those that align with preferred national stories. In the early morning light of that August day in 1944, as scissors flashed and crowds gathered, as women became spectacle and communities enacted ritual purification, something profound occurred beyond the immediate humiliation. Historical narrative itself was being shaped, determining which experiences would be commemorated and which suppressed, which suffering acknowledged and which minimized. The true battle of occupation and liberation involved not only military control, but control over memory itself, determining whose stories constituted official history and whose remained unspoken until time created space for fuller recognition. Céline Beaumont's hair fell on Saint-Martin's cobblestones alongside thousands of other women's across France, marking not collaboration, but the complexity that official narratives would simplify for decades afterward. Her experience reminds us that history's most important lessons often lie in what societies initially choose not to remember, in the silences between celebrated narratives, and in the experiences of those who navigated impossible choices when survival itself required compromise. The legacy of the tondeuses extended far beyond the immediate post-war period, becoming a suppressed wound in French collective memory that would take generations to properly acknowledge. While the physical markers of punishment eventually faded, hair regrew, tar washed away, marked doors were repainted, the psychological and social consequences endured both for individual women and for French society as a whole. By the 1950s, as France rebuilt under the Fourth Republic, official narratives emphasized resistance heroism and minimized the moral complexities of occupation. School textbooks presented simplified versions of wartime experience where French citizens either actively resisted or quietly awaited liberation. The messy reality, where most people navigated daily compromises between these extremes, remained largely unexamined in public discourse. The tondeuses received no official recognition, their experiences relegated to family whispers and occasional oblique references in literature. For women like Céline Beaumont, who had survived public humiliation, the silence surrounding their experiences reinforced isolation. While living in Paris, after leaving Saint-Martin, Céline encountered other women with similar histories, recognizing them through subtle signals, a particular wariness in social situations, careful avoidance of conversation about liberation celebrations, hesitation when discussing wartime experiences. These women formed informal networks of support, meeting in cafes or private homes to share stories that remained unwelcome in broader society. We recognize each other. Céline confided to Henri during one of their infrequent meetings in 1956. Not through any visible mark, but through what remains unspoken. When someone changes the subject too quickly when occupation is mentioned, when they flinch slightly at liberation footage shown in cinemas, when they touch their hair unconsciously during certain conversations, these are our identification signals. These networks provided practical support, as well as emotional validation. Women shared information about employment opportunities with understanding employers, neighborhoods where anonymity was possible, and strategies for building new identities disconnected from wartime experiences. They exchanged names of sympathetic doctors who treated lingering physical effects of punishment without judgment, scalp infections from unsanitary cutting, skin damage from tar application, stress-related conditions exacerbated by trauma. In 1958, one such connection led Céline to employment at the Education Ministry, where her teaching background proved valuable despite her inability to provide references from Saint-Martin. Her supervisor, Madame Claudette Dufresne, reviewed her application with unusual attentiveness before hiring her. "I recognize gaps in your employment history," Madame Dufresne remarked during their interview. 1944 to 1946 is often a difficult period to document. The subtle acknowledgement required no elaboration. Madame Dufresne had worked in Bordeaux during occupation, experiencing similar community judgment after liberation. Their shared history remained unspoken but understood, creating professional opportunity where official channels might have failed. Through such connections, many tendus gradually rebuilt lives in urban centers where anonymity provided protection against their past. They married, raised families, developed careers, and participated in France's post-war reconstruction, all while carrying private histories at odds with public commemoration of liberation. Their silence became both protection and prison, allowing reintegration into society while preventing healing through acknowledgement. For Céline, this reintegration came at significant personal cost. Relationships remained complicated by her inability to share her full history. When dating in the 1950s, she discovered that potential partners fell into predictable categories: those who would reject her entirely if they knew her past, those whose interest would transform uncomfortably into fetishistic fascination, and the rare few capable of understanding complexity without judgment. After several painful experiences, she chose carefully, eventually forming a long-term relationship with Robert Lenoir, an architect whose own wartime experience as a prisoner of war had left him similarly disconnected from triumphant liberation narratives. We built a life in the spaces between public memory and private truth. She later explained to a historian documenting women's post-war experiences. We created our own commemorations, our own understanding of what the war had been, separate from what newspapers and politicians described. It was a parallel history, no less true for being unrecognized. The first significant challenge to simplified resistance narratives came in 1969 with historian Robert Paxton's Vichy France Old Guard and New Order, which examined French administrative participation in occupation with unprecedented scholarly rigor. Though Paxton's work focused primarily on political collaboration rather than everyday survival strategies, it created initial fractures in the mythology of universal resistance that had dominated for decades. These fractures widened through the 1970s as a new generation raised questions about their parents' wartime experiences. Children born during occupation or immediately afterward reached adulthood with curiosity about historical silences. Some discovered family photographs with cutout figures or missing pages corresponding to liberation periods. Others encountered contradictions between official narratives and grandparents' oblique references to community punishment. These discoveries prompted questions that challenged carefully maintained historical simplifications. For daughters of tendus, this generational inquiry often revealed painful family secrets. Marie-Claire Fournier, daughter of a woman punished in Normandy, described her discovery in a 1976 interview with feminist magazine Des Femmes. I found the photograph in my grandmother's attic when I was 22. My mother seated on a chair surrounded by men with scissors, her face unrecognizable beneath tar markings. When confronted, my father admitted witnessing her punishment but doing nothing to prevent it. He explained that intervention would have marked him as a collaborator too. Understanding that my father chose self-preservation over protecting my mother fundamentally changed our family dynamics. Such revelations rippled through thousands of families as liberation's darker aspects emerged from enforced silence. The women's movement of the 1970s provided particular impetus for re-examining gendered punishment, recognizing the tendus phenomenon as exemplifying patriarchal control over women's bodies rather than legitimate justice. Feminist scholars began documenting these experiences, conducting interviews with aging survivors willing to break decades of silence. Henri's photographs gained new significance in this context, providing visual evidence supporting women's testimonies that might otherwise have been dismissed as exaggeration. The exhibition Les Non-Dites de la Libération received renewed attention when displayed at the Université de Paris in 1978, this time accompanied by academic analysis examining gendered aspects of transitional justice. Céline, approaching retirement from her administrative position, agreed to participate in a panel discussion following the exhibition. Addressing an audience of students and academics, she spoke publicly about her experience for the first time since the Liberation Committee hearing decades earlier. What happened to women like me was not justice, but ritual purification. Communities used our bodies to process collective trauma, to externalize guilt about accommodation, and to demonstrate renewed patriotism through punishment. The men who determined our fate, who had made their own compromises during occupation, redirected attention from their accommodation by spectacularly punishing ours. Her testimony, alongside those of other survivors, contributed to emerging scholarship recognizing the tendus as victims of gendered violence rather than justified retribution. This reframing challenged post-war binary narratives dividing French citizens into resistors and collaborators, acknowledging instead the spectrum of survival strategies most people employed during occupation. The 1980s brought further scholarly attention as historians Fabrice Virgili and Alain Brossat conducted comprehensive research documenting the extent of the phenomenon across France. Their work confirmed what survivors had long known, that between 20,000 and 40,000 women experienced head shaving and public humiliation, making it not an isolated excess, but a systematic aspect of liberation. This research revealed regional patterns, ritual consistency, and organizational elements suggesting community sanction rather than spontaneous mob action. For Céline, now in her 70s, this academic validation provided mixed comfort. "They're finally listening. Adieu," she remarked to Henri during their last meeting before his death in 1982. But most of us carried these experiences for 40 years without acknowledgement. Many died with their humiliation unrecognized and unaddressed. Historical correction comes too late for them. Indeed, by the time scholarly attention focused on the tendus, demographic reality meant many survivors had already died, taking their testimonies with them. Others remained unwilling to revisit traumatic experiences, even when invited by sympathetic researchers. The historical record, consequently, captured only a fraction of experiences, with rural cases particularly underrepresented compared to urban documentation. Céline's contribution to historical memory extended beyond her personal testimony. In 1985, she established a small foundation supporting documentation of women's wartime experiences, providing financial assistance for oral history projects recording survivors' testimonies. These recordings, archived at the Bibliothèque Nationale, preserved voices that official narratives had silenced, creating counter-memory to complement and challenge traditional historical accounts. Through this foundation, Céline connected with Josephine Lambert, a doctoral student researching gendered aspects of occupation and liberation in rural communities. Josephine's grandmother had experienced a similar punishment in a village near Bordeaux, later taking her own life in 1947 after years of community ostracism. This personal connection motivated Josephine's research into how rural communities, with their closer social networks and limited anonymity, presented particular challenges for punished women compared to urban experiences. In cities, women could disappear into anonymity. Josephine explained during a foundation meeting in 1987. In villages, reinvention was impossible. Every interaction carried the weight of communal memory. Women remained marked long after physical signs disappeared. Céline agreed to assist Josephine's research by returning to Saint-Martin for the first time since her departure 43 years earlier. This return, carefully planned to minimize emotional distress, included preliminary contact with current village administration, an identification of sympathetic locals who could facilitate discreet interviews with elderly residents who remembered liberation. On a cool autumn morning in 1988, Céline and Josephine arrived in Saint-Martin by rental car, parking near the church rather than in the central square where Céline's public humiliation had culminated decades earlier. The village had changed substantially, modernized shopfronts, paved roads replacing cobblestones, satellite dishes on ancient rooftops, while maintaining its essential character. "It's smaller than I remembered," Céline remarked quietly as they walked toward the mairie. The distances between places that seemed enormous during the procession are actually quite short. At the mairie, they met with the current secretary, Monsieur Benoit, who had arranged access to municipal archives, documenting liberation and the subsequent committee hearings. These records, rarely consulted since their creation, provided official counterpoint to Céline's lived experience, the bureaucratic language sanitizing punitive ritual into administrative procedure. "The minutes from your hearing are remarkably detailed," Josephine noted while reviewing the documents. "They record testimony against you but minimize your defense. Your statement is summarized in 2 sentences, while accusations receive full transcription." Céline nodded, unsurprised by this documentary bias. Official records served subsequent narrative requirements. My perspective complicated the story they needed to tell about justified punishment of collaboration. Their research extended beyond archives to include interviews with elderly residents who had witnessed liberation events. These conversations revealed how community memory had evolved over decades, with some former participants expressing regret while others maintained conviction about punishment's necessity. Most striking were inconsistencies between what residents remembered and what archives documented, selective forgetting that protected community self-image while preserving core mythologies. Madame Rousseau, wife of the former gendarme and now 82 years old, provided particularly revealing testimony about how Saint-Martin processed its liberation history. For years afterward, no one mentioned what happened to the schoolteacher. Children were told she left for health reasons. When younger people asked about liberation celebrations, stories focused on parades and dancing, not punishment rituals. We created a sanitized version for ourselves as much as for others. This collective amnesia extended to physical spaces associated with Céline's punishment. Her former house had been completely renovated. The door where black paint had marked her status replaced entirely. The school where she taught had been expanded, her classroom incorporated into larger administrative space. the platform where she had been displayed after the procession no longer existed, replaced by a modern market structure. Even the physical landscape had been reshaped to accommodate forgetting. Most significantly, Céline and Josephine visited the cemetery where records indicated Lucienne Moreau had been buried 3 years earlier. Standing before her grave, Céline reflected on interconnected fates separated by circumstance and choice. She was 19 when arrested for resistance activities, approximately the same age as I was when I began teaching here. Different decisions, different consequences, yet neither of us fully controlled our subsequent narratives. Her father became a resistance martyr, while she lived with knowing someone intervened to save her. I became a village pariah while carrying the knowledge that my greatest crime was visibility. This visit to Saint-Martin provided crucial material for Josephine's dissertation, eventually published as Rural Purification, Gender and Justice in Provincial France, 1944-1946. The work received significant academic attention for its methodological innovation, combining archival research, oral history, and spatial analysis of punishment rituals. Céline's experience, though anonymized at her request, formed a central case study demonstrating how educated single women faced particular vulnerability during liberation judgment. Beyond academic impact, Céline's return to Saint-Martin catalyzed personal reassessment of her relationship with the past. For decades, she had constructed identity around separation from her village experience, creating psychological distance through geographic relocation and selective memory. Walking familiar streets, seeing familiar faces aged by time, connecting physical spaces with traumatic memories, these experiences forced integration rather than compartmentalization. I carried Saint-Martin with me regardless of physical distance, she later wrote in private journals donated to her foundation after her death. Returning allowed me to place those experiences properly within my life, rather than allowing them to define its entirety. I'm not only the woman in those photographs. I existed before that morning and continued existing afterward, accumulating experiences equally significant to my personhood. This integration proved crucial during Céline's final years as France's relationship with occupation history evolved further. The 1990s brought increased willingness to acknowledge wartime complexity, including President Jacques Chirac's 1995 official recognition of French administrative participation in Jewish deportation, breaking decades of denial regarding Vichy government complicity. Within this context of expanding historical acknowledgement, the tendus gradually gained recognition in mainstream historical narratives, rather than remaining confined to feminist or revisionist scholarship. Museum exhibitions, documentary films, and educational materials began including these experiences alongside traditional resistance narratives, recognizing that complete historical understanding required acknowledging liberation's darker aspects. Céline's foundation actively supported these initiatives, providing consultation for museum exhibitions to ensure accurate representation of women's experiences. When the Caen Memorial expanded its World War II exhibits in 1996, Céline reviewed proposed displays about gendered punishment, offering suggestions that humanized tendus beyond victimhood while acknowledging systematic nature of their humiliation. The foundation also supported educational initiatives addressing this history in secondary schools, developing materials that help teachers discuss occupation complexity with appropriate nuance. These materials used Henri's photographs alongside survivor testimonies to challenge simplistic moral narratives, encouraging students to consider how they might have navigated similar circumstances without benefit of historical hindsight. Céline herself occasionally spoke with student groups, though advancing age limited these appearances. During one such session at a Paris lycée in 1996, a student asked whether she had forgiven those who punished her. Her response revealed the evolving nature of her relationship with the past. Forgiveness implies a transaction between individuals. Someone requests pardon, another grants it. What happened to women like me involved collective action, where responsibility was diffused across communities. No individual claimed full accountability, making forgiveness largely theoretical. More important than forgiveness is understanding, recognizing how ordinary people justify extraordinary cruelty when fear replaces reason and performance replaces justice. This perspective reflected Céline's lifelong commitment to complexity over simplification, to understanding over judgment. Throughout her later years, she maintained this commitment through both public engagement and private reflection, contributing to France's gradual reconciliation with its multifaceted wartime history. When Céline died in 1997 at age 85, her obituary in Le Monde acknowledged her contributions to historical understanding alongside her professional accomplishments. This public recognition, naming her experience as a tendu rather than employing euphemism, demonstrated how significantly French society had evolved in its willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable historical truths. Her foundation continued operating after her death, maintaining archives of survivor testimonies and supporting ongoing research. The Henri Mercier photography collection, including images from Saint-Martin's liberation, became a standard reference for historians studying gendered aspects of wartime experience. Together, these resources ensured that women's punishment during liberation remained visible in historical narratives, rather than returning to previous silences. By the early 21st century, as France commemorated World War II anniversaries with increasing temporal distance, the tondeuse phenomenon had become integrated into mainstream historical understanding. Museum exhibits, documentary films, and historical novels addressed these experiences with nuance impossible during earlier decades, when immediate participants still occupied positions of community influence. Perhaps most significantly, local communities began acknowledging these aspects of their history rather than maintaining protective silence. The commemoration in Saint-Martin in 2004 represented one example among many similar initiatives across France, where municipalities recognized historical complexity through inclusive memorialization rather than selective commemoration. For younger generations, studying this history, the tondeuse phenomenon provides crucial lessons about justice, gender, and historical memory. Their experiences demonstrate how communities process collective trauma through gendered punishment, how women's bodies become symbolic territory during national crisis, and how historical narrative selectively preserves certain experiences while minimizing others. These lessons extend beyond specific historical context to illuminate broader patterns repeating throughout history when societies experience occupation, liberation, and subsequent identity reconstruction. Similar gendered punishment occurred following World War II in other European countries, including Belgium, Italy, Norway, and the Netherlands, where women associated with occupying forces faced public humiliation. More recently, comparable phenomena emerged during civil conflicts in various regions, where women's bodies continue serving as sites for community judgment and purification rituals. Understanding the tondeuse requires recognizing how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary cruelty when moral frameworks collapse under occupation pressure. The villagers who participated in Céline's punishment were not inherently monstrous. They were neighbors, former friends, community members who had themselves navigated occupation through various compromises. Their transformation into punishers demonstrates how quickly social bonds dissolve when fear replaces reason and performance replaces justice. Equally important is recognizing how historical narrative construction privileges certain experiences while marginalizing others. The initial absence of tondeuse from official liberation histories reflected not oversight but deliberate omission serving narrative requirements of post-war France. Their experiences contradicted preferred mythology of unified resistance and unambiguous liberation, necessitating their exclusion from commemorative frameworks until sufficient time had passed for more nuanced historical assessment. Céline Beaumont's journey, from village schoolteacher to public pariah to historical witness, traces this evolution in collective memory. Her initial silencing, subsequent survival through reinvention, gradual reclamation of voice through testimony, and eventual integration into historical narrative mirrors France's relationship with its complex wartime past. Her experience reminds us that history happens not only in dramatic resistance actions or formal collaboration, but in the mundane compromises ordinary people make when surviving extraordinary circumstances. The women whose hair fell on village streets and city squares across France left more than physical traces on cobblestones. They left questions about justice that remain relevant beyond their specific historical moment. Who determines guilt when entire societies face impossible choices? How do communities balance accountability with compassion when emerging from collective trauma? Whose bodies bear the visible markers of judgment? And what does this selection reveal about underlying power structures? These questions have no simple answers, just as occupation presented no simple choices. The tondeuse phenomenon reminds us that historical understanding requires acknowledging all aspects of the past, not only heroic resistance and obvious villainy, but the vast, complicated middle where most lives unfold. Their experiences, preserved through photographs and testimony, challenge us to resist binary judgment, to recognize complexity, and to understand that survival itself constitutes resistance when options narrow to impossible choices.